welcome. Our guest tonight is Alan Wake. This time he wanted to do something a little different. A deep dive into who he is as an artist and as a man. Where he comes from, where he draws his inspiration, what demons he wrestles with in the dark hours of the night.
Alan Wake 2 came as a surprise to many when it was revealed back at the Game Awards in 2021. It seemed to be one of those games that was just never going to be released. The original Alan Wake was a cult classic. To some, it was an attempt for Remedy to differentiate themselves from their Max Payne history. And to others, it was a game with a lot of heart that fumbles in a lot of places but makes up for it with intrigue and passion from the studio behind it. I fell into the second camp of people when I first played Alan Wake about 5 years ago, and then I replayed it before I played Alan Wake 2, and my opinion remained relatively unchanged. I wasn't expecting a lot from Alan Wake 2, but the game utterly blew me away, and today I want to talk about it. What really made this game stand out, and what makes it as good as it is. This video is by no means a story analysis, but it will contain spoilers for the entire game. If you would like a quick catch-up before I talk about the game, I would recommend the 2 Alan Wake videos by Gingy, since they're really well made. I will be discussing the prologue in its full and basically the ending in its full, but in between that, it's free game. I have linked the 2 videos in the description, and I would also like to issue a content warning for those who have issues with photosensitivity, since this game has a lot of flashing lights and colors that, while limited, will be used within the video. But with that out of the way, let's begin.
Back to the beginning. We all come to a story with hopes and expectations, looking for an answer. Sometimes it would be better to live with that hope without ever knowing the full story.
Alan Wake 2 cold opens 13 years after the original. Back at Cauldron Lake in Bright Falls, we see someone emerge from the lake, the home of the Dark Place, and your only objective is to just move forward. That is, until you run into some members of what look to be a cult. Running is of no avail, as no matter where you run, the members of the cult get you and strap you to a table and start to perform what seems to be a ritual. That is, until 2 tourists find them and disrupt the ritual. We then see the tourists get chased away, and then a pan over to Cauldron Lake as a callback to the first game, with possibly the hardest title card of all time. We then cut to 2 FBI agents driving to Bright Falls to investigate the murder that we just witnessed. Saga Anderson, our playable character, and Alex Casey, which is a familiar name to anyone who played the first Alan Wake. And I'll talk about Casey in a minute, but first, Saga. Saga to me serves as the complete opposite of Alan, not only in gameplay, but her function in the story as well. Saga's campaign revolves around her putting together clues to solve the ever-unfolding mystery behind the cult that killed the man at the start of the game. Saga's campaign is filled with payoffs and answers that add to a feeling of going deeper down a rabbit hole, which is 100% intentional as Alan serves as a polar opposite, but I'll get to him later. Alongside Saga, we meet Alex Casey, who was thought to be fictional but is actually a real person who shares the same name as the fictional detective. Casey serves as Saga's partner, but also a metaphorical present within the Dark Place and in Alan's story. Casey in reality is a stubborn agent who is matter-of-fact and straight to business, but in the Dark Place, he is the same fictional cop from Alan's books. This fictitious version of Casey serves as a representation of Alan's destructive thoughts as a writer, manifested in a physical form by the Dark Place. But more on that when I talk about Alan's story, as it's more relevant there. Anyways, the 2 arrive at Cauldron Lake to investigate the murder at hand, and after gathering clues at the murder scene, we are instructed on how to use Saga's Mind Place. Saga's Mind Place serves as a place away from everything that you use to piece together clues, whether it be through the clue board or the profiling system that really only serves as your one true method of truth. That being said, it's never a straightforward answer. Since you're profiling everyone telepathically, the game gives the answers indirectly, with Saga then making the leap in order to come to a proper conclusion. I found that the Mind Place was a great gameplay breakup. It never felt like it was tacked on, but rather integral, because again, you are solving a mystery. In case you couldn't tell, Saga's story is very much inspired by shows like True Detective and Twin Peaks. In an interview with Sam Lake done by Callum Marsh for the New York Times, Lake states, quote, "To me, there's always been so many different things to be excited about in popular culture. I try and find my inspiration through other mediums, so that we can do something that's never been seen in a video game before. When playing through the prologue, a lot of crime drama influence is almost immediately noticeable, whether it be the cult issue at hand or the dynamic between Saga and Alex, and the longer you play, the more influence you see as it all culminates into one big picture. Speaking of the bigger picture, after you gather all the clues at the crime scene, Saga and Casey decide to have the body looked at by the medical examiner, and when you eventually arrive at Bright Falls, it's during the annual Deer Fest, the same celebration that was happening within the first Alan Wake. So we already have those parallels between games. This is where we meet Sheriff Breaker, who takes us to investigate the body, who was revealed to be Agent Nightingale from the first game. From the start, we already have an interesting premise, because the last thing we saw of Nightingale was him being dragged away by the darkness, only for him to emerge from Cauldron Lake 13 years later and then die almost instantly. While examining the body, Saga asks Sheriff Breaker about the manuscript pages she's been finding around the lake, and when he goes to present her with some that he found, he gets seemingly teleported away, and then Nightingale comes back to life. Saga then uses the manuscript pages she had to defeat Nightingale. Saga and Casey then go back to Cauldron Lake to investigate further, since obviously this case goes deeper. Saga finds Nightingale's heart with the instructions to read it aloud and open the overlap. She brings it to the witch's ladle and performs the ritual in order to open said overlap. Saga then goes in and defeats Nightingale once and for all, and after doing so, she's presented with a vision, a conversation, she isn't entirely sure, with someone in a black suit. Then we come back to reality, and the shore has now been dried up, and someone appears by the lakeside. It's Alan Wake, seemingly out of the dark place for the first time in 13 years. The prologue for this game is quite long, and the reason I went over it in the way that I did was because the narrative flow was very much intentional. After this point, we gain the ability to explore the newly accessible areas of Cauldron Lake, exposing us to various puzzles and boxes containing supplies, as well as the ability to freely switch between Saga's story and Alan's. From this point onwards, you can progress the game however you want, doing Alan's all the way through and then doing Saga's, vice versa, or switching after every chapter. This level of freedom is unprecedented in a survival horror game. Typically, games within the genre make you play through one story and then the other. Alan Wake 2 flips it on its head, allowing for different interpretations of the story based on how you choose to approach these campaigns. With the context of the prologue out of the way, I want to talk about Alan's story, more specifically, why I believe it works so well.
So you were drawn to stories early on.
My dreams would light up my imagination.
And you had nightmares night and day.
Yeah, but with the clicker, I chase those frights away.
Despite the fact that the two stories can be played in whatever order you choose, the events of Alan's story do take place before the events of Saga's, and in the campaign, we see Alan trying to escape the dark place while seemingly in a loop, constantly bringing him back to this show called In Between with Mr. Door. And in this talk show is where we see a lot of the live-action material and storytelling for the game. Saga's story is a somewhat grounded detective mystery. Her events are in the real world, which is now a horror story, while Alan's is a more otherworldly feeling romp throughout the dark place, which is why he gets a lot of the live action material, because it adds to that feeling of being out of place in a place that feels all too familiar, but isn't. This familiar feeling has manifested itself into a messed up, dirty feeling New York, almost like a more realized version of New York from another Remedy game, Max Payne. The Max Payne comparison doesn't just end at the setting though. Throughout Alan's playthrough we see two versions of Alex Casey. We see the personified version of Alex Casey from the novels, the gritty detective who's trying to figure out what's going on, and he has a hunch that Alan Wake is behind it. We eventually get cornered by him and shoot him out of fear or panic. One of the two. After Casey is shot, Alan then remarks that picking up Casey's light and gun was him fulfilling the role of detective, which is ironic since this version of Casey is a dark manifestation of Alan's thoughts as a writer, and it correlates to the gameplay of you playing detective. The other version of Casey we meet here isn't Casey at all, but rather Sam Lake, as in the writer of the game, who has been cast as Casey in the live-action movie that is being made within the Dark Place. He's nothing more than an actor, a physical appearance for Casey to take. Alex Casey, at least in the Dark Place, is an obvious allusion to Max Payne. Remedy doesn't own the Max Payne rights anymore, as Rockstar acquired the rights back in 2002, which allowed Remedy to continue making the game, but they no longer own the IP. But Casey, like I've mentioned, is this gritty cop in this dark, depressing rendition of New York, who has now had his role taken up by Alan, and as Alan, you will follow in the footsteps of Casey, using clues from his investigation into the cult of the Word to try and make the plot for your next novel in order to escape the dark place. If the reference wasn't clear enough, Sam Lake even does the Max Payne face in one of the talk show episodes, since he was the original face capture for Max Payne. And Casey is voiced by the late and great James McCaffrey, who died shortly after the release of Alan Wake 2 in a battle with cancer. McCaffrey was the original voice actor for Max Payne and eventual facial capture for Max Payne 3. But the Max Payne illusion is really nothing more than that, a reference. It doesn't translate to the rest of the game, as Alan Wake 2 is by all means a survival horror game, with much more of an emphasis on horror in Alan's campaign, with Saga's focusing more on combat and resource management. Alan's story will have you facing against the shadows of people who roam the street. They'll heckle you and try and get in your head, but very rarely do they attack you. But there is a chance that one will attack you, and that's where the horror in Alan's gameplay comes in, because these guys are fast. This makes Alan's combat feel secondary to the story, which I feel like it was an intentional choice, since Saga gets more action-focused combat encounters that you would find in other survival horror games like Dead Space. Within this approach, though, Alan's story is much more visceral and horrifying with its scenery. In one level, you explore an abandoned subway trying to find inspiration for your novel. However, one train car that you enter is filled with the scorched bodies of people who died in a blaze trying to escape. Every time I have to see it when I review my footage, chills just run down my spine. Similarly, later in Alan's story, we explore this abandoned hotel where a cult performed a murder in the guise of a play. Exploring the hotel just fills you with this sense of dread, because you get this gut feeling that something has gone down, you just haven't quite put together all the plot threads yet. Those situations are powerful, showing you momentary horror that helps Alan put together a bigger picture for his novel. But one particular scene is possibly one of the most effective uses of horror in any game I've ever played. Throughout Alan's story, a main motivator for Alan to leave the dark place is so that he can get back to his wife, Alice, and at times you will go to a version of your penthouse within the dark place where you're exposed to different parts of a short film that Alice made about her constant interactions with Mr. Scratch, who she thinks is just Alan. It's taxing on her mental state, and what follows is just horrifying.
World, what I see. I can't keep going like I have been. It's time for a perspective shift. To go from photographer to subject. From artist to art.
At the end of the game, right as we're about to achieve our goal, we see what the point of the film was. We see that Alice took her own life, and the simple nature of the video is what's so effective about it. No audio other than the click of the camera shutter, no gore, just a woman at her breaking point. A woman not able to go on any further with the burden of being constantly tortured. It's a quiet but striking moment in a game filled with loud and bombastic moments. Speaking of loud and bombastic moments, the game has two musical set pieces, crammed between the constant horror. The most famous being the musical level where you play through a musical rendition of the story performed up to that point on the talk show with Mr. Dorr. The entire set piece involves Alan trying to break the cycle of song and dance, which is representative of a greater theme of loops and cycles, and it's honestly one of the highlights in a game full of highlights. Somehow, in this horror game, there is this stark contrast with the rest of the game in a musical, yet nothing is lost because it all fits into the game thematically. Like I mentioned, Alan Wake 2 is a game with many layers. This game can mean something completely unique to different people based on how they interact with the story. Thematically, the game is very free-form despite its mostly linear nature because of the order you can play the stories in, which is what makes the game different. Alan's story is particularly freeform as it falls back on the more meta choices and indirect methods of relaying information because the Dark Place works within the context of the story. If the story is overcomplicated and doesn't make sense, neither will the Dark Place. The game explicitly mentions that we don't know how the Dark Place works, however, we know that art is a key part, and the reason that the Dark Place is so complex is because Alan is overcomplicating everything. During the various episodes of In Between with Mr. Door explains that Alan is overcomplicating everything, and the world around him suffers at the cost of Alan wanting to make his narratives as complex and smart as possible. Thematically, I feel like this idea of Alan overcomplicating the story is very appropriate, as it mirrors the real-life perspectives I've seen towards the game online. I see a lot of people saying that the game is pretentious or overly complex for the sake of being complex, similar to another game that I love, Death Stranding, and it comes back to the idea of the game's freeform yet linear nature, which allows people to see the game differently, as those who may only experience the game through lore recaps and let's plays may not have the same experience as me or other people who played the game. And that's okay, because stories are meant to be interacted with in this way. It's what makes discussing the game so interesting to me. But enough about Alan's story. What about Saga? Alan's story within the game only takes up about half the game. The other half takes place as Saga, the character I've already talked about. Her purpose within the narrative is just as important, if not more important than Alan's at times, simply for the fact that she is the protagonist of the horror story that Alan wrote, and without her, there's no ending. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I already briefly spoke about Saga as a character in the prologue, so instead I want to talk about her campaign as a whole, rather how it's different from Alan's. In early drafts of the script, as I wrote more and more about Saga, the best way of looking at Saga's campaign is like the opposite of Alan's, like yin and yang. What happens within Saga's story is supposed to be the opposite of Alan's. Where Alan's story leaves you with a lot of questions, Saga's is dedicated to answering the questions that her story brings up. Both follow the player as a detective, where Alan is in a more passive role looking back at what Casey did for ideas for a novel. Saga is on the front lines, coming to conclusions by herself, putting together clues. Even in gameplay, they're opposites. Alan's gameplay mainly involves around walking in New York in a mostly linear fashion. Saga's gameplay is a more non-linear approach, allowing the player to more freely explore different areas and come back later to unlock different puzzles in places not previously accessible. When I came to the conclusion that the two are supposed to act as opposites of one another, it allowed me to better understand why Remedy chose to structure the game in the way that they did. It makes sense to let the player freely switch between the two because of how different they are. They both serve different purposes in a greater narrative. Saga's greater narrative purpose lies within the real world of the game. Her story is being affected by what Alan and Scratch are doing in the Dark Place, the horror story that they are writing and trying to escape with and change reality. At the start of the game, we learn that Saga has a husband and daughter, but as the story progresses, the horror story starts seeping into reality. The people around Saga believe in this twisted version of reality that the story set in place. Within this twisted horror narrative, we learn that Saga, who Alan made the protagonist of the novel, actually lived a much different life. In this reality, Saga and her husband got a divorce, and her daughter drowned one day while she was at work. And as the game goes on, more and more people tell Saga that she's just trying to cope with such a tragedy. And it's a shame that she came back because this is where her daughter drowned, but Saga's never been to Bright Falls before. While the horror story is twisting reality, some aspects were kept real. As we go throughout the game, we meet Thor and Odin, the old gods of Asgard. We've seen them in the first Alan Wake, and they've been here within the talk show segments too, but we didn't really understand how they fit into the narrative until Saga meets them. It turns out that Saga is actually related to Thor, as he is her grandfather. This is also how we learn that Saga's mind place is more than just a gameplay mechanic. It's a real thing that she has because of her relation to Thor and her connection to the Dark Place. Saga's mother tried to convince her that it was all in her head and she's just making things up out of fear that she'll end up as crazy as Thor and Odin are. A lot of the later parts of Saga's story revolves around this connection to Tor and Odin, specifically the Valhalla nursing home that they stay at, and how it's affected by the Dark Place, and how the residents are also affected. This level is probably one of the best in the entire game. From a design perspective, it's the apex of playable horror within the game, in my opinion. The static yet live feeling nursing home mixed with this eerie nature of the wellness center attached to the nursing home. It creates one of the best visual environments in the entirety of Saga's playthrough. Both buildings aren't just visually satisfying, though. The audio was just as horrifying. The constant sounds of creaks in the floorboards and the water droplets create this unnerving feeling that is poignant throughout the entire time you're playing. The story within the nursing home is also an amazing one, as we learn that Cynthia Weaver, the woman from the first game that helps us find the clicker, is one of the elderly residents here, but in reality, she's been taken. At the same time, we learn that the darkness is also trying to take over Tor and Odin, as the fact that they are much older makes them weaker to the corruption of the darkness, which is how it took Cynthia. A lot of the story in this chapter is told through the manuscript pages, which I typically don't interact with collectible notes, but I love the manuscript pages in both this game and the first Alan Wake, as they reveal little by little about the plot at hand. Take, for example, the page Cynthia Corrupted. It reads, Cynthia Weaver hated being old. She'd been a doer, a fighter. Now the bathroom frightened her. Afraid she'd break her hip like Norman, Cynthia had always kept her lantern close, to hold the darkness at bay. Oh dear, my lantern, I think I've lost it, Cynthia said. This'll put a smile back on your face, my dear, a voice said, a man's voice. Someone in the bathroom with her. In the dark, the light bulb had blown. She had meant to replace it days ago. How could she forget? She had slipped getting out of the tub. She now lay in the tub. She lifted her hand. It looked wrong. Too many hands, in a black void, with no sensor up and down. She was underwater. A shape pushed her down. A dark water pressed itself onto her. She screamed. It came out in bubbles. Cynthia was a fighter against the darkness, but eventually she just got too old, and the darkness eventually took her, manipulating her, guiding her to the bathroom in which she eventually drowns, killing her, making her taken. We see this same body in Alan's playthrough, in the hotel, but we have no explanation as to why. All the manuscript pages in this game are great, but I wanted to highlight that one specifically. This entry shows how brutal the darkness is in its attempts to take as many people as possible, and if we don't help Tor, he can end up just as bad, if not worse, than Cynthia. Now I feel like it's an appropriate time to talk about the combat, or rather the lack thereof, since this chapter is one of the lightest when it comes to combat. One of my big criticisms about the first Alan Wake was the combat. It was widely accepted that the unique premise was neat, however the combat was pretty bad. What made the combat bad, in my opinion, was the fact that the weapons felt weak and flimsy. You get double-barrel shotguns and pump-action shotguns and hunting rifles, yet they all don't feel any different. They all just feel like guns. Alan Wake 2 addresses the complaint by making weapons feel meaty and better to use, but they also decided to massively decrease the number of combat encounters and how many enemies are in said encounters. It's more like a Resident Evil 1 style approach where there's at most 3 enemies to take care of at a given time, the only exception to this being in the musical levels. With the decrease in combat comes a greater emphasis on story and non-combat gameplay. This has come at the cost of some people referring to the game as a walking simulator, and to that I would agree, in the same way that Resident Evil is a walking simulator. A lack of combat doesn't make a game a walking simulator. A walking simulator is something like Firewatch or Death Stranding, where the main gameplay loop involves walking from point A to point B. These aren't bad games, but to say that a survival horror game is a walking simulator is disingenuous, since the genre isn't about combat. It never has been. A wide criticism of the genre by those who are fans looking in is how long it takes to kill enemies, because you're not supposed to mow through enemies like Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space would have you believe. You're supposed to be smart and save resources, which means you won't be killing a lot of enemies. I love the approach that Alan Wake 2 took to combat. It makes me appreciate the game more, but to those who aren't fans of the genre looking in, you can see where this criticism comes from, even if it is just a case of a game being criticized for being something that it's not. The times when Alan Wake 2 attempts to be an action game is when the game is at its weakest. The final concert sequence as Saga is a holdout similar to the one in the Anderson farm from the first game, but it was by far my least favorite part of the game. The combat, like I mentioned, is really only suited to go against at most like 3 enemies. So naturally, you fight like 15 and it just doesn't feel good. But the combat being bad in one section really does not diminish the game in my opinion, because even throughout the section, I was still enjoying myself because the game oozes with this charm that shows the love for everything that went into the game. A love that is especially prevalent within the final chapter of the game. The game's focus on art as this all-powerful entity that the Dark Place needs to work comes full circle within the conclusion. The final chapter takes a full 180, going from bombastic holdout that I previously mentioned to this dark look at both our protagonists. But again, the idea of Saga and Alan being yin and yang to one another shows up. Alan finds the final tape from Alice, the same one that I showed earlier in the video, and learns the truth. He is enraged. He believes that Scratch, his evil doppelganger, is changing the book, but in reality, it's Alan from a previous point in his adventure. Okay, let me explain. Throughout Alan's story, he's being chased by Mr. Scratch, a dark, twisted version of Alan, personified by the Dark Place. But in reality, there is no Mr. Scratch. It's just Alan, with all his pent-up rage finally being let out. It wasn't Scratch that was torturing Alice. It was Alan. When Alan runs into the writer's room and kills Scratch at the typewriter, it's just Alan, not yet at this point in the loop. Not yet at the point to where rage consumes him. This is where we learn that Alan's story is a loop. We then come back to Saga, who has captured Alan, Scratch, it doesn't matter, they're one and the same. She siphons the darkness out of Alan, and it's then brought on to Alex Casey. But before the darkness consumes Casey, it sends Saga into Cauldron Lake, into the Dark Place. She's trapped in her mind against her fears and doubts, but unlike Alan, she overcomes it. She tells herself that she's doing the best she can, and that people can make mistakes. She then leaves her mind place and goes into the Dark Place that Alan was in. Earlier within Alan's story, we're told to put a shoebox by the statue for later. We don't know what it's used for. This is what it's used for. Saga is now where Alan was the entirety of his playthrough, but she uses the materials left behind by the shoebox to come back to the writer's room with Alan. Within the writer's room, they have to come up with an ending that satisfies the story. Within these confines, a hero must lose everything. So, they agree to have the darkness taken from Casey and transferred back to Alan, where Saga then shoots him with a bullet of light. The game ends on a cliffhanger. That was until New Game Plus was released, where we learned that it's not a loop, it's a spiral. Similar to the ending of the first Alan Wake, the game ends on a phrase that can mean a lot. But within the context of the game, we can infer that this means that the events of Alan's story aren't a loop. It's not supposed to happen the same way forever. Rather, it's a spiral, and every time he repeats something, it changes. So that means he's getting closer to an end, but it'll take time because he has to go deeper within the spiral. When I played the ending, it had me on the edge of my seat the entire time. The constant reveals mixed with the amazing introspective pieces for both characters really did wonders for my appreciation of the game. During the end chapter, the game is at its most hands-on. Typically, I would hate this. Having gameplay interrupted so often for cutscenes is not my favorite thing, but in Alan Wake 2, the game has earned this conclusion. It earned the right to finish its story how it wants. The game isn't trying to be a Hollywood spectacle, but rather a culmination of everything: film, music, TV, literature, everything. Which is what I think video games should strive to be. The medium is already a mixture of everything that goes into making film, music, TV, and literature, while also being combined and needed to be programmed in for the player to have interesting gameplay to go along with it. And I feel like Alan Wake 2 properly encapsulates that feeling of video games being this grandiose mixture of everything that I love about art. Alan Wake 2 is an amazing survival horror experience. It may not have the replayability of something like Resident Evil, but that doesn't matter, because the game sets out to do something that is wholly unique and give you something that only Alan Wake as a series can offer. The fact that Alan Wake is so unique is why it's no surprise how fast Alan Wake as a character has entered the survival horror zeitgeist. The first game was destined to be a cult classic with a lot of flaws, but a lot of heart. But 13 years later, Remedy was able to deliver something significantly better, something that I would not be ashamed to call a masterpiece. This game is everything that I want in a survival horror game, despite its flaws. It's a game that I can't bring myself to say anything negative about. Unlike the other games that I really do appreciate, I can normally criticize those pretty fairly, like if you watch my Spider-Man videos, but for Alan Wake 2, I just couldn't bring myself to it. Alan Wake 2 may not be everyone's cup of tea. Some say that it's pretentious, boring, or hell. I've even seen people say that the game is woke because you play as a black woman. But it's my type of game, and that's all that really matters to me at the end of the day, because these are all just silly internet opinions that'll never really matter. Who cares? But nevertheless, I'm excited for Control 2 and whatever the future from Remedy brings. Thank you. If you made it this far, I would just like to say thank you for sitting through whatever this was. I know it took a little longer than I was expecting, but I really just couldn't find the right words to talk about this game. I kind of got writer's block, but like not really. I just couldn't figure out how to put it down on paper. But nonetheless, I would just like to say thank you for making it this far. And yeah, the support on the last video was fucking massive. It was insane. So thank you for all that. And to that, I say we have a good 2024. I mean, start of the year, so yeah, I don't really got anything else to say. That's my 2 cents about Alan Wake. But yeah, thank you. See you later.